The desert outside Bent, New Mexico was completely still. No passing cars. No neighbors calling out across fences. Just wind moving across empty land, and a house sitting far off the road like it had been forgotten by time itself. Inside that home, 3 people were still alive. Victor Perea moved through the property earlier that evening like it was just another ordinary night. Nothing about him suggested it would be his last. Mary Mauser had been in contact with family earlier that day. Normal messages. Normal tone. The kind of conversation nobody thinks twice about until it suddenly becomes the last one. And Killian Mayes was there too. At first, nothing seemed unusual. No alarms going off. No warnings. No instinct that something was wrong. But sometime that night, everything changed. Because after a certain point in the timeline, the messages stopped. The phones went silent. The home went quiet. And whatever happened inside those walls was never spoken about by the people who were there. By the next time anyone came looking, there was nothing left but questions. And a growing sense that something inside that remote property had been carefully erased. Days later, investigators made a discovery on a dirt road outside Bent that would change the entire direction of the case. A vehicle. Overturned. Burned almost beyond recognition. Inside were the remains of all 3 individuals. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Because what investigators found inside the property itself suggested this was not a simple act of violence. It was controlled. It was deliberate. And it may have been covered up in real time. So the question becomes: what really happened inside that remote New Mexico property, in the final hours before 3 lives disappeared forever? And who tried to make sure no one would ever know the truth? Welcome back to Dark Case Files, where we break down the most disturbing real-world cases, piece by piece, to understand what really happened behind the headlines. Before we begin, this episode contains discussions of violent crime and homicide. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Now, to understand this case, we have to understand the people at the center of it. Victor Perea was a man who, by all accounts, kept to himself. The kind of person who didn't draw attention. Not because he was mysterious, but because he lived a private life surrounded by familiar routines. Mary Mauser was known differently. Friends and family described her as communicative, emotionally present, and consistent in keeping contact with those she cared about. She was the kind of person who didn't just disappear from conversations. And Killian Mayes was younger. Still building a life, still shaping identity, still connected to people and places that would later become central to an investigation he could never explain. All 3 were connected through family ties and shared proximity at a remote property near Bent, New Mexico. Bent is not a busy town. It is not a place of constant movement or noise. It is quiet. Isolated. The kind of environment where everyone notices when something changes. And yet, when these 3 individuals vanished, there was no immediate alarm. No public panic. No immediate emergency response. Just silence, stretching longer than it should have. It wasn't until concern grew from outside contacts that authorities were alerted. And even then, what they initially found did not immediately explain the scale of what had occurred. At first, it looked like a missing person situation. But missing persons cases don't usually end with burned vehicles in the desert. And they don't usually involve scenes that appear to have been altered after the fact. So investigators began doing what they always do. They started with the timeline. And slowly, that timeline began to break apart. In the weeks leading up to the disappearance, life at the remote property near Bent appeared stable from the outside. Routine. Predictable. Quiet. There were no widely reported public disputes. No major incidents that immediately suggested what was coming. And that is what makes this case so difficult to reconstruct, because much of what investigators had to work with was absence. Absence of communication. Absence of witnesses. Absence of clear warning signs. Victor Perea was believed to be spending most of his time around the property, maintaining daily routines and managing household responsibilities. Those close to him described a man who was consistent in his behavior, someone who valued structure and familiarity. Mary Mauser, meanwhile, remained in contact with family outside the property. Text messages and calls in the days leading up to the disappearance would later become one of the key elements investigators analyzed. Nothing in those messages initially suggested danger, just normal conversation. Everyday life. Killian Mayes occupied a more complex position within the household dynamic. Younger, still connected to multiple people within the broader family structure, and present at the property during the critical time frame investigators would later reconstruct. At the time, none of this stood out. Because nothing had happened yet. But hindsight has a way of reshaping ordinary details into something heavier. Investigators would later examine the final 48 hours before the disappearance. Phone activity became central. Location data was reviewed. And witness statements, even the smallest ones, were placed into a growing timeline. At one point, all 3 individuals were confirmed to be at the property. After that, the record becomes less clear. There were gaps. Unanswered periods of time. And a sudden cutoff in communication that didn't match previous patterns. Then came the final known window. The last point at which all 3 individuals could reasonably be accounted for. After that moment, there was nothing. No outgoing communication. No confirmed sightings. No verified activity. Just silence. And investigators would later say that silence was one of the first real indicators that something had gone seriously wrong. Because in most missing persons cases, someone tries to reach out. Here, no one did. It was several days later when the situation escalated from concern to criminal investigation. A welfare check or missing persons report, depending on the account, brought authorities to the area surrounding the property near Bent. What they found there did not provide immediate answers. Instead, it deepened the mystery. The first major breakthrough came not from the house itself, but from a location off a remote desert road. A vehicle was discovered overturned and burned. The damage was severe enough that identification required forensic confirmation. But eventually, investigators determined that the remains inside belonged to Victor Perea, Mary Mauser, and Killian Mayes. That discovery immediately changed the classification of the case. This was no longer a disappearance. It was now a homicide investigation. And the scene where the vehicle was found suggested something important. This was not where the violence began. It was where it ended. Attention quickly shifted back to the property. Because if the bodies had been moved, then the original scene still existed somewhere. Inside the home, investigators began a systematic search. What they reportedly encountered included signs of disturbance inconsistent with normal daily activity. Items out of place. Evidence suggesting cleanup efforts may have occurred. And forensic indicators that pointed toward a struggle or violent incident having taken place inside the residence. Ballistic evidence became a key focus. So did trace evidence. And so did digital devices, phones, messages, and location data that could reconstruct movements minute by minute. Early on, investigators considered multiple possibilities. A targeted attack. A domestic dispute. Or a situation involving people known to each other rather than an outside intruder. Because nothing about the scene suggested forced entry from a stranger. Instead, everything pointed inward. Toward people who already had access. Toward people who already knew the property layout. And toward someone who had enough time after the incident to attempt to control what investigators would eventually find. As forensic analysis continued, a critical detail emerged. The fire that destroyed the vehicle appeared to have been set intentionally. Which meant someone had taken steps not only to commit violence, but to delay identification and obscure evidence. And that changed the entire scope of the investigation. Because now detectives weren't just asking who did this. They were asking how long they had to clean it up afterward. But then came something that shifted everything again. Forensic interpretation suggested that parts of the scene inside the property may have been altered after the initial act of violence. Not just disturbed, but intentionally changed. And that detail forced investigators into a new line of thinking. If someone had time to stage a vehicle. If someone had time to move bodies. If someone had time to attempt cleanup. Then the timeline wasn't just about what happened. It was about who remained after it happened. And at that point, one question became impossible to ignore. Who was still there when everyone else was already gone? By the time investigators had processed the burned vehicle and returned full focus to the remote property near Bent, New Mexico, the case had already shifted into its most dangerous phase. Because now they weren't just reconstructing a disappearance. They were reconstructing a controlled sequence of events. And that always points back to one thing. Someone had time. Someone had access. And someone had knowledge of what investigators would later find. As the investigation developed through witness statements, forensic links, and early interrogations, two names began appearing repeatedly in connection with the timeline. Killian Mayes and Cassandra Douglas. Both individuals were connected to the broader family network surrounding the victims and had proximity to the property during the critical time frame. At first, investigators treated them as persons of interest. But that classification quickly changed. Because when detectives began comparing statements against physical evidence, the inconsistencies were immediate. According to investigative findings reported in court documents and local reporting, several key pieces of evidence shaped the direction of the case. Signs of gunfire activity linked to the property area. Forensic indicators suggesting cleanup attempts inside the residence. Chemical agents consistent with attempted decontamination. Fire damage consistent with intentional destruction of evidence. A burned and overturned vehicle located in a remote desert area containing the victims. But what made the case escalate was not just what was found. It was the sequence. Because the evidence suggested a progression. Violence inside the property. Movement of bodies. Transportation away from the scene. And final destruction by fire. That required coordination. And time. When questioned separately, investigators noted that the accounts provided did not align with physical evidence. Initial statements described confusion and attempts to distance from the core events. But as forensic results returned, inconsistencies began to appear. Timeline gaps widened. Locations shifted. And small details, such as when individuals left the property, began to contradict phone data and recovery timelines. Then came a critical development. One of the individuals allegedly changed their account during questioning. According to investigative summaries, this revised statement included acknowledgement of involvement in post-incident actions, including helping move items, assisting in cleanup efforts, and participating in efforts to conceal what had occurred. This shifted the case from unclear disappearance to coordinated aftermath activity. And that changed everything. Because even if someone didn't witness the initial act, their actions afterward could still establish criminal liability. Investigators began focusing on a working theory. That the crime scene inside the property was deliberately altered after the fact. Evidence pointed toward attempted removal of biological traces. Use of cleaning agents not typical for household use in that quantity. Disposal of physical evidence in remote or concealed areas. Rapid departure from the property following the incident. This was no longer a chaotic event. It was structured. Which meant investigators now had to consider something even more disturbing. That multiple people may have coordinated in the aftermath. And then came the detail that redefined the entire investigation. The burned vehicle was not found near the property. It was discovered in a separate remote location, deliberately chosen. Far enough to delay discovery. Isolated enough to reduce witness likelihood. And damaged enough to slow identification. Which meant one thing. The final stage of this case didn't happen at the property. It happened afterward. In transit. In control. In silence. And that raised the most important question of all. Was the goal only violence? Or was it also time manipulation? A way to delay discovery long enough to escape, clean, and disappear. While investigators built timelines and reconstructed movements, the families of the victims were still operating in uncertainty. At first, they believed this was a missing person situation. Then came the silence. Then came the vehicle. And then came confirmation. 3 lives. Gone. And what remained was not closure, but fragments of a story still being pieced together by strangers. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement formally escalated charges against the primary individuals connected to the case. Killian Mayes and Cassandra Douglas were both arrested in connection with the deaths of Victor Perea, Mary Mauser, and Killian Mayes. Charges included multiple counts of first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, conspiracy-related charges tied to post-crime actions, additional charges related to vehicle theft or misuse, as reported in filings. The case moved into the judicial system where early hearings focused on probable cause findings, evidence admissibility, forensic reconstruction of events, digital and communication records. Investigators presented a timeline built from phone data, witness interviews, vehicle recovery analysis, scene reconstruction inside the property. At the time of reporting, the case remains legally unresolved in terms of final trial outcomes. But what has been established through court filings is the structure of the investigation. This was not treated as an unsolved disappearance. It was treated as a coordinated homicide investigation with post-event concealment efforts. Even with arrests made and charges filed, one central truth remains. A courtroom can determine guilt, but it cannot restore what was lost. And in cases like this, justice often moves slower than understanding. Because the most difficult question is not who was charged. It is what exactly happened inside that house in the final moments before everything changed. Victor Perea, Mary Mauser, Killian Mayes. 3 names that were once part of ordinary life inside a remote corner of New Mexico. A place that most people would never think about. Until something happened there that could not be ignored. What makes this case difficult is not just the violence. It is the silence that followed it. The absence of answers in the beginning. The confusion in the middle. And the realization at the end that some moments are gone forever, no matter how much evidence is gathered afterward. Because no matter how detailed the investigation becomes, it cannot rewind time. It cannot undo decisions. And it cannot return what was taken. If you are watching this and you followed the case all the way through, thank you for spending your time here. These are not easy stories to hear. But they matter because they remind us that behind every case file, there were people living lives that mattered deeply to someone. If you have thoughts on this case, leave them in the comments below. I read every single one. And if there's another case you want covered on Dark Case Files, suggest it. It might be the next one we break down together. If this documentary moved you or held your attention, consider subscribing. Not just for the channel, but for the stories we still need to understand. Until next time. Stay aware. Stay curious. And stay safe.